Warm greetings, everybody. It's 4 p.m. my time in Sydney, and I think I know you're all very busy people, so I'm going to start our dialogue today. I know more people will join us, but it's just really so lovely to see you and to have your participation. My name is Pip Dargan, and I'm the Principal Advisor on Capacity Assessments and International Engagement at the APF Secretariat, and I want to welcome you all, members, colleagues and friends. I also like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Sydney, Australia, and I live and work on the traditional lands of the Gadigal and Wangal peoples of the Eora Nation, and I wish to pay my deep respects. Thank you for joining us today. It really is wonderful to have APF members come together through this dialogue series to exchange and discuss matters with each other. And we've developed this dialogue series as a way of keeping members connected and informed, particularly while we're still not able to meet in person during this pandemic. The APF is really delighted to host this dialogue along with the National Human Rights Commission of New Zealand, which of course is a member of the APF, on the issue of discrimination in employment, including on the issue of pay equity and the role of national human rights institutions. This is the fourth virtual dialogue that we've held in partnership with an APF member. Other member dialogues have been held with the National Human Rights Commissions of Malaysia, Korea, India, on the issues of monitoring detention centres, protection of vulnerable groups, and people with disabilities. This type of engagement really serves to strengthen our network and strengthen our resolve to work together to promote and protect human rights at home and in the region. And what's evident to me is that there really is a strong desire from our membership to exchange, listen, and learn from each other despite the physical distance that we've endured during the pandemic. I'd like to briefly outline the structure of today's program for the dialogue. In the first 40 minutes, we will have 3 speakers from the National Human Rights Institutions of New Zealand, Australia and India. First, we will have our partner, and I'm very, very grateful to have Dr. Karenina Sumio, who is the Equal Opportunity Commissioner at the New Zealand Human Rights Commission, and she will be speaking on the national inquiry it is conducting on the issue of Pacific pay gap. The second speaker will be Dr. Rosalie Atty, who is the Policy Advisor from the Race Discrimination Team at the Australian Human Rights Commission, and she will be speaking on anti-racism and cultural safety in the Australian workplace. And our third and final speaker will be Mr. Rajiv Jain, who is a member of the National Human Rights Commission of India, and he will be speaking on the workforce and gender pay parity. So thank you to all 3 speakers for your time and commitment to this dialogue. Very much appreciate it. Thank you to the New Zealand Human Rights Commission for suggesting this topic. Our speakers will have up to 10 minutes each, and then after the speakers, we'll have an open session for around 40 minutes in which other participants can make comments, ask questions of the speakers, or make short remarks or interventions if they so wish on the issue that we're discussing today. And then finally, we'll have a short closing remark from the New Zealand Human Rights Commission and also from the APF. Colleagues, just a kind reminder that we are recording this session. If you prefer not to be seen, please do turn off your video. But we also love to see your faces. I particularly do. So, you know, stay on video too if you like. And can I please remind you to please keep your microphone off if you're not speaking, or to put your microphone on if you are. Along with recording this dialogue, we will be uploading it to our APF YouTube channel as well. And further, you can either during or after the dialogue provide your thoughts in an evaluation of the dialogue, and the hyperlink is available in the chat box. And after this dialogue, I will also email you the link for the evaluation. So now I wish to invite our partner and our first speaker, from the Equal Opportunity Commissioner from the New Zealand Human Rights Commission, Dr. Karenina Sumio. Karenina, thank you so much. Welcome. Please take the floor.
Yeah, tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings, maror soifua. Everyone, it's great to see you virtually. I feel like it's been a long time since we've actually seen each other face to face, but this will do for now. So greetings, everyone. And thank you, Pip and the team there at APF for bringing us together once again to share, I suppose, learnings. And we're very keen also to hear from our other NHRIs in our region. I just want to acknowledge our Chief Commissioner, Paul Hunt, who's online, along with staff from the Human Rights Commission who helped put this inquiry together, and we're still working at it. So I'll just go into it. This inquiry has probably taken at least a year in the planning, and there was a whole lot of work that went on to, I suppose, set the grounding for it, because ultimately we want to change. And those changes relate to changes in legislation, to social attitude, and in some ways, a change in the sense of worth and self-belief of those that we are hoping the advocacy will support. So the fundamental human rights we're talking about are the rights to work, includes the right to equal employment opportunity and pay equity, to just and favorable conditions of work, to safety and non-discrimination in the workplace, equal pay for work of equal value, and an adequate standard of living. So those are our guiding human rights pillars, I suppose, that we always keep in mind as we're carrying this through. And the reason why we're focusing on Pacific peoples numerically make up less than 10% of the population. However, they are consistently the lowest income earners in New Zealand, in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And by looking at the population that's left behind, if I can put it that way, we think that by the learnings that we take from there will be relevant to others. So Pacific peoples have a lot in common with the rest of, probably around 30% of the population in New Zealand, of people who've come to and have made New Zealand their home in terms of first generation settlers and now to second, third, fourth generations. So the word migrants relates to only a very small proportion of our population. People have settled here. We've got, the diaspora generations. So by understanding what the hurdles are for Pacific, those lessons will actually benefit all of us in terms of lifting and addressing inequities for a significant portion of our population, be it in healthcare, construction, hospitality, horticulture, whatever. So that is the ultimate goal. To set the foundations for the inquiry, the Human Rights Commission launched a campaign for pay transparency to end pay secrecy back in 2019. And we launched a campaign. We involved the unions, we involved business, friends and allies in business, and certainly we reached out to civil society, because this was never going to be a Human Rights Commission alone thing. It had to be a collective thing. We need to take our country with us, but also not speak on behalf of those who are victimized by inequity. So it was really important to bring our Pacific communities with us. Pacific women especially have been very, very vocal. So that began in 2019. We handed our petition to government in February 2021. In 2022. In March 2022, there was a recommendation from the Workforce and Education Select Committee to government to develop pay transparency measures, informed by our petition and the campaign, and also the voices of others in civil society who have come along with us on the campaign. So the role of the NHRI in this case has been, I suppose, to shift the discourse, to involve those who are victims of inequity but haven't felt empowered to speak out, for example, Pacific peoples, And I think we have done that in a way that's also brought other allies. So even if people disagreed with us, like, businesses who didn't want to be, who thought that they were transparent enough and were doing the right thing, we had to bring them along also by bringing some of their peers along. So that was really, really important for us. And then the inquiry itself, focusing on Pacific people, we launched, basically took off in 2021. And we've completed the engagements. We've engaged about 1,200 approximate Pacific peoples. We've engaged, about 24 businesses between large and small sizes. So we get the mix. So we've got SMEs as well as Pacific owned businesses. We've engaged with unions from the public service, from the private sector. And of course, we've engaged Pacific communities themselves. So it has been a huge undertaking. And when COVID hit just as we were starting our engagements. So of course, with the shutdowns, we weren't able to travel. And that, and that was quite a thing we had to work through. Okay, so how do we reach our Pacific communities if we can't see each other? And of course, the digital divide, threw in another complexity. And there were moments there when I thought, is this the right time to conduct an inquiry? We've got a global pandemic, and then I thought, well, actually, as a result of the pandemic, the risks to being exploited were actually increased. The risks to inequity being perpetuated were actually increased. So we had to continue, and we had to do all we could to reach out to Pacific communities. And so we did that. And as a result, we're about to finish writing up the inquiries and the findings. And we hope to launch it next month in October. And in the meantime, we have a campaign plan to lobby members of parliament across all the different parties to try and gain support so that when this is handed in to parliament, it's not a surprise and they know what it is that we're asking for. So all the time we are talking, creating allies, and even, like I say, even if people didn't agree with us, at least they knew. And all the times we're making clear what the fundamental human rights are that we're talking about. It is the right to work, the right to an adequate standard of living, to equal employment opportunities, and pay equity. So I think those are the things that I just wanted to share with the group tonight. Some of the recommendations that are coming out do relate to, for example, we want a review of our Equal Pay Act. It's 50 years this year. Since we've had the Equal Pay Act, clearly not everyone's paid equally for work of equal worth. We want to require businesses to start recording ethnicity. Unless you record it, you can't show it. So those are some of the things we want pay transparency to be legislated for. And also we are calling, in addition, for the government to ratify Convention ILO 190, which is around violence and harassment. Because what that research has shown, and the research was conducted within the timeframe of the inquiry by the Human Rights Commission, was that Pacific people and our Asian populations and people who are not born in New Zealand suffer the highest rates of racial discrimination in employment. And we're talking about 60% up. It's a huge problem. So the inquiry has helped give visibility to these issues. And we're doing the best we can to work alongside allies to lobby for change. So I'll leave it there for now, Pip, and we can talk more about it later. Whaftai.
Thank you, Karenina. And I know there will be questions, I'm sure there will be of you, and we'll wait till the next session. But thank you very much for talking about the Commission's use of its inquiry powers to undertake a very important inquiry, and which is, as you said, looking at changes in legislation along with social attitudes, worth and self-belief. And also, I think, important part of that work really is you're talking about the stakeholder and the development of allies in that process, which I think is so critical to the work of a national human rights institution. I understand that you'll have your outcome of the report available in October, and you've talked about some of the preliminary recommendations or findings that you'll be suggesting in that report, which is around Equal Pay Act, the recording of ethnic data also, which is really important, pay transparency to be legislated, the ratification of ILO 180 on harassment. And so we look forward to hearing more about that later in the year. So thanks, Karenina. I'd now like to request our second speaker to take the floor, and that's Dr. Rosalie Atty, who is the Policy Advisor of the Race Discrimination Team at the Australian Human Rights Commission. Rosalie, thank you very much, and please take the floor.
Thank you so much, Pip. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining today from the unceded and sovereign lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to Gadigal elders past and present, and to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across the continent. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I also want to extend that respect to the First Nations peoples of the lands that you're all joining from today, and to the First Nations peoples present in the meeting. I acknowledge the long-standing leadership of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and other First Nations peoples across the Asia-Pacific region and across the globe in the work of anti-racism. So as Pip said, my name is Rosalie Atty. I'm an advisor in the Race Discrimination Team at the Australian Human Rights Commission, and I'm the lead on the Commission's National Anti-Racism Framework project. Thank you so much for the opportunity to give you an overview of the project and the outcomes from our initial scoping phase into this work relevant to discrimination in employment. And I just want to say that it is a privilege to present today in the company of Commissioner Sumio and Mr. Rajiv Jan. Thanks to you both for the opportunity to present alongside you and to learn from the work that you've been doing. Thank you, Pip, for facilitating this dialogue. So in March 2021, the Australian Human Rights Commission called for a national anti-racism framework as a national central reference point for anti-racism across sectors. This project came about in the context of the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement in the US in 2020, and the heightened attention that that brought to long-standing activism in relation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait, long-standing activism of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in relation to Indigenous deaths in custody. In the pandemic period, we've also seen evidence of heightened racism, including towards Asian communities. The pandemic has exacerbated differential service access and outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and other negatively racialised communities. And we've also seen spikes in Islamophobia, anti-Semitism and racist extremism. There's been widespread support for a national anti-racism framework and really strong engagement with the Commission during the scoping process, which we've been undertaking since May of 2021. So there were several themes identified very consistently across sectors and communities at this priority setting level via consultations and submissions. And these provide a really solid grounding for continued work beyond this initial scoping phase. And thanks to the very generous and critical support and contributions from participants in the consultation and submissions process, sharing with us their priorities and vision for a framework, excuse me, the project has successfully secured government commitment into the future. So this was a commission-led initiative in the sense that we were kind of supporting community calls, but now the federal government has committed $7.5 million funding to the development and implementation of the strategy over the next 4 years. So between May 2021 and April 2022, we conducted approximately 100 scoping consultations with 300 organisations, including government departments and agencies, human rights agencies, peak and community organisations, service providers and subject matter experts. And then we partnered with some of those organisations and agencies and had the privilege of facilitating 10 community consultations across the nation. And really that was just the start. And we're hoping that, the community engagement is going to be a lot stronger in the next phase of the framework development. We put together a conversation and consultation guide, and that was made available to organisations who wanted to host their own consultations, and many took that up and hosted consultations with community. And we also invited public submissions. So from October last year through to February this year, we received 171 submissions, and over 60 of those were from individuals, so community members who were really supportive of the framework and shared with us their priorities. We invited in-language submissions and submissions in any format. We did sort of social media messaging in relation to the call in the top 20 languages spoken other than English as well. And we made we commissioned an easy read English guide to the submissions as well. So many community and peak organisations, as well as government departments and agencies, aided the Commission in getting the call out far and wide and in making the process as accessible as it could be with the resources that we had at the time, which were very small. And discrimination in employment was a key issue that emerged from this scoping phase. So community members, as well as service providers, described how racism affects the capacity of some to obtain work and how racial discrimination faced within the workplace impacts employees' career progression and retention, as well as their well-being. Participants highlighted that these experiences were exacerbated when racial discrimination intersected with other forms of discrimination in relation to gender, age, visa status, and discrimination based on English language proficiency and accent. These experiences are very well supported by research in this space as well. The Commission heard that even where there are diversity and inclusion strategies in place, including anti-racist hiring practices, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander employees and those from other negatively racialised communities often experience poor job satisfaction, poor job security, and negative health effects. So we heard that this needs to be a workplace health and safety issue, and that programs, policies and procedures need to be put in place so that the workplace is a safe one for First Nations employees and for others from negatively racialised communities to support diversity across the employment life cycle and in workplace leadership. Cultural safety was identified by many participants as a best practice approach to addressing race-based barriers and harms experienced in relation to job seeking, especially within the workplace. So in 1989, Māori nurses developed the concept of cultural safety in seeking to address inequities experienced by First Nations peoples by challenging the view that everyone should be cared for in the same way. Cultural safety requires service providers and organisations to develop meaningful and accountable relationships built on an understanding of communities' unique needs and strengths. In the Australian context, First Nations health service providers are leading work on cultural safety across the sector, and the Commission received detailed submissions on principles that underlie culturally safe health service provision, and these extend to culturally safe service provision for migrant, refugee, and faith-based communities that are negatively racialised. They're increasingly being recognised and cited across sectors. I'm just going to skip through because I realise that I'm taking up quite a lot of time, but I'd really be happy to share some of the things that the solutions, I suppose, that people proposed cultural safety involved and things that need to be embedded at the institutional level. And so, if the people are interested, I'm happy to share that in the question time. But at the moment, we're drafting the report on the findings, which will detail these outcomes. And it's due for release in September of 2022. And the next phase, as I said, is going to involve seeking out collaborations to undertake further comprehensive, culturally safe and accessible consultations with communities, including targeted consultations with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities as well. So thank you so much for the opportunity to share those, an overview of those findings, and very happy to talk about some of the specific suggestions in detail if anyone's interested as well. Thank you, Pip.
Thank you, Rosalie. That is such an interesting project that you're working on, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about that and about the National Anti-Racism Framework too. And excellent to hear that the federal government is contributing $7.5 million over 4 years for the strategy, which is excellent. And I was really interested to hear about some of the feedback that you've received in the process, particularly in relation to discrimination in employment, and some of those really key issues, which is around progression in employment, retention and wellbeing. And I think wellbeing is more and more significant, particularly through COVID. So we will very much appreciate receiving your PowerPoint presentation, and hopefully look forward to hearing more about the report when it's released in September. So another one that will be released pretty quickly. Thank you, Rosalie. Now I have the great pleasure to also invite now our third and final speaker for today, and that's Mr. Rajiv Jain, and he is a member of the National Human Rights Commission of India, and his topic today is on workforce and gender pay parity. Mr. Jain, please take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Pip. Dr. Sumyo, Rosalie, and my colleagues in different countries who are involved in protection of human rights and its advocacy and their advocacy. I shall be speaking on workforce and gender pay parity. Initially, I would dwell on the provisions of the Constitution of India and other Indian laws and government schemes on this subject. Then I would speak about the nature and extent of wage pay parity, gender parity in India. And finally, I would dwell on what the National Human Rights Commission India has done in the past few years on this subject of gender parity. The convention, the CEDAW, Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, Article 11, mentions about elimination of discrimination against women in measure of employment. Employment includes not only recruitment, but promotion, transfer, and so forth. The Constitution of India ensures the right to equality of all persons under Article 14, and this is a fundamental right. In Article 15 and 16 further elaborate on that. Article 39, which is a directive principle, mandates the government to have equal pay for both men and women. In course of time, through different Supreme Court judgments, the notion of equal pay for men and women has been read into the article, fundamental right, article relating to right to equality. In fact, in a famous judgment related to employment opportunities of air hostesses, the Supreme Court held that they cannot be retired or superannuated at the age of 3. In fact, they have to be treated equally like their male colleagues and can have the same age of retirement as their male colleagues. In addition to these constitutional provisions, there are other specific legislations which relate to this subject. So there is an Equal Remuneration Act which mandates, it provides for equal pay for equal work. There are other specific legislations, for instance, the Plantation Labor Act, the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, Unorganized Workers Social Security Act, Building and Other Construction Workers Act, Sexual Harassment of Women at Workplace Act, Maternity Benefit Act, and many other similar legislations which build up to providing equal employment opportunities to women. And employment includes, like I said, not only recruitment, but also conditions of service, transfer, promotion, and so forth. In addition to these legislative provisions, the government has several welfare schemes for women. And these welfare schemes include, for instance, Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao. It was to ensure that girl children get educated because there is a direct correlation between equal opportunities for women and wage parity for women with their educational level. Also, other schemes like Sukanya Samriddhi Yojana, Kishori Shakti Yojana, different merit scholarship schemes for women children, Nai Roshni scheme, Working Women Hostel scheme, Mahila Shakti, Swadhar Greh, and others. These different schemes are positive-oriented schemes to help women at different stages of their life, including childhood, education, employment, maternity, and so forth. And all these have an impact on their parity with men in the sphere of employment, as also their parity with men in the sphere of pay. Now to move on to the nature and causes of the gender pay parity, the World Economic Forum in their recent report have rated India as 122 rank in terms of wage equality for similar work with men. Globally, it is held that women make about $77 as opposed to $1 earned by a man for similar work. But there are occupational preferences or cultural barriers which entail continuation of gender pay parity. In India, more than the organized sector, the unorganized sector has more instances of absence of gender pay parity. Women employed in agriculture as labor force or women employed in construction, the non-mechanized construction, form a large significant number. So about 40% of the construction workers in India are women, and about 90% of women workforce are involved in non-mechanized construction in India. Now, this construction could be large projects, small projects, and in these non-systematic or unorganized sectors, the prevalence of absence of wage parity in different genders is at a higher level. According to the National Family Health Survey 2019 to 21, 25.2% of the women surveyed were employed, while 74% of the surveyed men had a job at that time. As per another survey done by an NGO named Dasra, it revealed that informal women workers in India in construction earn up to 30 to 40% less than their male counterparts. It also adds that 50 million workers are engaged in construction, which employs the largest number of informal and migrant workers. And there are 10 times more women than men in this sector. On the role of National Human Rights Commission, the National Human Rights Commission last year submitted a detailed report on the CEDAW, the implementation of CEDAW, and made several recommendations on implementation of the different articles of CEDAW. It also has a core group on women which meets periodically and deliberates on different issues, and also submits advisories to the Government of India focusing on gaps in policies as also gaps in implementation of policies. The National Human Rights Commission of India has encouraged research work on gender disparities in women and other related aspects like education of women or employment of women and so forth. The impact of COVID was also witnessed among on employment of women. That is another research study that the National Human Rights Commission is engaged in. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jain. I really appreciate your intervention there on the workforce and gender parity, and laying out for us very clearly some of the constitutional and legal framework. And of interest, I thought those surveys were particularly interesting, and appreciated hearing about what the Commission is doing, some of the work that it's currently undertaking in relation to and has done on providing a report on CEDAW, and made recommendations, that you have a core group on women, which I've actually participated in, which last year, which I found incredibly useful, and that it makes periodic reports and provides advisories to government and the work that the Commission is doing in relation to research work and gender disparity on women. So thank you very much, Mr. Jain. Now, colleagues, the three presenters have made their presentations and thank you for that. I now open the floor to any questions that you may have, any comments. A number of you may also wish to add a very short intervention about perhaps some of the work that your institutions are undertaking in relation to discrimination in employment in particular. Very much welcome for you to please put your hand up to nominate that you'd like to raise a question or to make an intervention in relation to what the speakers have presented to us today, but any information that you would like to provide us while we're together for this next half an hour or so. So please do let me know, please do indicate if you wish to speak, and if you do, please put on your microphone. And I'm looking to see if there's any hands up at the present. I don't know, perhaps even some of the speakers may want to add something that they have thought of subsequently that they'd like to add. I'm particularly interested, and perhaps if I could open up a question to Karenina, if that's possible. And yeah, thanks, Karenina. Undertaking national inquiries is quite resource intensive, and it's a long-term process. So it doesn't stop with the production of the report, but I'm just interested in terms of understanding the resources that it takes to undertake such a systemic kind of review. How many staff would you say that you have working with you to undertake the work and to undertake stakeholder engagement and to do the writing? And then, after the report, I know you mentioned that you, of course, be lobbying parliamentarians, but are there any other steps that you think you'd be taking after the report to pursue the recommendations? Thanks, Karenina.
Yeah. We're a relatively small agency compared to the Australian. It was great to hear that federal government Australia is committing $7.5 million to the next phase of the work. Our inquiry is $400,000. That's $400,000, and I think we managed to, Paul managed to scrape another maybe 100 here, there to help. That is all. That is it. And that's for a full-time project lead, and with and within that we've contracted a literature review, a survey of industry data and pay data. We've called in favors. With my own advisor for my whole portfolio for equal employment opportunities and women's rights, we've pulled some of their time into here. We've just done the best we can, but at most $500,000, I would say, or maybe 600 million at most over that 2 years' time. And so we really have relied on our networks, on our relationships. And also because I hold delegations for women's rights and business and human rights, when I'm advocating for women, this is relevant to to gender equality. And when I'm advocating for laws for modern slavery, this is related to that. So in terms of conducting the portfolio, we try to maximize it by making sure that there's visibility of the inquiry in all those branches of work. But yeah, that's the resourcing, and certainly as we know, you have to have a spirit of endurance. This change takes a while. One of our ultimate goals is to reaffirm to Pacific people their worth to the New Zealand economy. we found it in COVID when we stopped bringing in RSE workers. My gosh, our mega billion industries came to a standstill. So, it's a part of it. We can change laws, but if you don't nurture, also reaffirm the sense of worth of those who are suffering inequity, then you can only go so far. So, there's a lot of media outreach. I have a comms person who covers all of my portfolio, but we've committed quite a lot of her time to supporting this. And, we're on TV a lot, in the newspaper a lot. So a lot of that outreach has been really important to giving visibility. And by being visible, by Pacific people being visible, suddenly it's given them a permission to complain. Just use that word for now, and to reach out to us. So it's been really, really powerful. But yeah, so the next phase, and this is also something that I'll have in common with other commissioners. Our terms are limited. We're not here forever. I only have one more year of my term to go. Wow. So all of that is factored into the time frame and what we can do and what we can achieve. So for the next year, we'll be campaigning. We'll be lobbying our business partners, as well as government, as well as the communities themselves. Again, pursuing that sense of self-worth for the communities, pursuing legislation change with government, and also working with unions, who represent Pacific workers, and as well as our business allies. We've got really good allies who want to do the right thing, but just don't know how. So, the year coming, starting next month, is concentrated on trying to embed some of those changes and those shifts in practices. Yeah.
Thank you. Can I ask one follow-up question with that? Is in relation to the Pacific community that you've engaged with, and I note that you said you've only got one more year in your term to go, and these recommendations for implementation take many years, as we know. So do you see it as part of the Commission's role to also almost, not capacity build, I don't mean that in a condescending manner, but to work with the Pacific community to ensure that they take the recommendations into the future when perhaps you're not there? So I'm just curious about.
Yes, absolutely. So that's why we're spending a lot of time talking to communities. We're spending, a lot of time linking out to Pacific people in corporates and influential positions, who even within like Deloitte and, those big firms, because we know that there are Pacific business leaders in influential positions who themselves are advocating for equal opportunity for Pacific. So trying to do all of that so not only it helps them, because remember, we didn't start this fight for equal opportunity and pay equity for Pacific. They've been calling for it. So there was already activity, but in a way, because the NHRI took it up, it's taken it to a whole other level. So we're maximizing, I suppose, the social license that an NHRI has to give visibility and to give voice when perhaps those communities, when they spoke out before, they were ignored. So, just recognizing the privilege that we have as an NHRI and the political capital that we have, and then working alongside communities, because our time will end, but we're talking about their lives and their future generations. So working alongside and doing as much as we can to support and empower them, and link with all of our brothers and sisters already in the corporate world and in Parliament. Actually, there are a number of Pacific people in cabinet roles in Parliament. So it's a moment in time thing, recognizing all of that and doing our bit.
Yeah, that's good. Making the most of opportunities.
Absolutely.
I do have one more question for you through chat. This is from the Philippines Commission. The question to you, Karenina, is after the release of your report on the National Inquiry on the Pacific pay gap, how are you going to enjoin the private sector, especially the businesses, to adopt your recommendations in closing the pay gap?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. So the inquiry has an expert advisory group, and on that advisory group is the chief executive of our Employment and Manufacturers Association. So they've got about 4,000 businesses, SMEs to large. So the business sector is already in, shaping and the questions, giving feedback, looking at the recommendations for businesses. So, and there are a couple of others from the private, from the business sectors. We also got unions on that reference group. as well as government reps. So as much as we can from the get-go, identifying the key partners so that, you know, they can see a part for themselves. And also we've run webinars doing it, and we've had our business partner be on the webinar, you know, to attract businesses to come and listen to them, you know, to the issues. So, but so that is our hope. So already they're helping us shape some of the recommendations. They don't agree with all the recommendations, but they respect our independence, and they're in the tent, you know, and we're talking with each other and helping each other shape the messages. Some of the messages have been shaped by that advice. Like you might come across to, like, basically it's if businesses don't understand what we're saying, then it's a waste of time. So he's helped us reshape some of the wording of things and recommendations. So we're doing our best.
Yeah, thanks, Karenina, and thank you from Joey as well for answering your question. I now have a question from the chairperson of the Myanmar Human Rights Commission, Mr. Mint. Welcome. You may need to unmute yourself.
I'm unmuted.
There we go.
Now, thanks, speaker, for giving me the floor. I've listened to the speakers very carefully. I had to express my appreciation to the three speakers or three NHRIs. I'm very much glad that these NHRIs are playing, and they are very fully, and they are doing their utmost to look after the rights of the people. My question is, directed to Dr. Karenina. The national inquiry they have undertaken is a big one, big undertaking. And you also raised the question of resources. That's the question I'm having in my mind. And so they have spent some of the money amount, but compared to Australian Human Rights Commission, it is very little. But the real success of the undertaking, real success of the national inquiries depends on how much fully the recommendations that can emerge later are implemented. So that means that National Commission of New Zealand still have a long way to go, and they might need a lot of resources down the line. So my question is, what is the role of the New Zealand government in that undertaking? Because even if the recommendations go, even if the recommendations are accepted by some, to be fully implemented them is most important thing, to make the project be a success. So how could the New Zealand government play a role here? That's my question. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, it is a good question. And that's why we've, like right from the beginning, we've engaged so that the two key government agencies is our equivalent, might be our Ministry for Business and Employment, and so we call them MB. And so they're in our reference group, as well as the Ministry for Pacific Peoples. So we've tried to identify the key ministries who we expect, to help move some things forward. So they're part of the advisory group. And it's also enabled access to certain information over the time of the inquiry. So those relationships were purposely selected and nurtured so that over time, things will happen. And in the mid, as I said, the unions are also part of the reference group. So one of the things that in terms of the ratifying ILO 190, as I said, the Convention of Violence and Harassment, we've joined with them on a campaign for government to ratify that. And that will go somewhere, hopefully, in terms of our fight to eliminate racism, as well as sexual harassment and bullying of migrant workers and of Pacific and our Indigenous peoples in the workplace. So it's a long-term investment, but we've tried to always include governments in our thinking and our works, but they also respect our independence. So whether or not they agree with our findings, it's our findings at the end of the day.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. And could I now invite Paul Hunt to raise your question, Paul?
Talofa lava, namaste, salam alaikum, Tanikoto katoa. Greetings, everybody. I'll be brief, but I want to begin by acknowledging Asia Pacific Forum and PIP and the organization of the Virtual Dialogue series. They're really helpful, really productive. So thank you for leading. Thank you for leading those. My name is Paul Hunt. I'm the Chief Human Rights Commissioner at the New Zealand Human Rights Commission. So it's my great privilege to work closely with Karenina Someo, Commissioner Karenina Someo, and her team, some of whom are on this call. I can see Nid is here and Rashna, and I'm sure there might be one or two others. And I want to very briefly acknowledge their brilliant work around the national inquiry on the Pacific pay gap. And this is their work, it's not mine. I just watch admiringly from a distance. But if I could just draw out two of the features of the inquiry that they run, which I set great store by, and I just highlight them in case they are of assistance to other colleagues on this call. The Commissioner Someo and her colleagues in their national inquiry on the Pacific pay gap, as Karenina explained, they have a holistic approach to human rights. They have an intersectional approach to human rights. What I mean is that they look at economic rights, that is workers' rights. They look at social rights, such as the right to an adequate standard of living. There is cultural rights dimensions to their national inquiry. And of course, there are issues of equity and equality. So looking at their work, one of the features that strikes me is that it has this holistic approach to human rights. It's not just equality, not just equity, important though that is, but there are these other human rights that are an integral part of the inquiry. And I think this holistic approach is exceedingly important. Workers' rights, social rights, civil and political rights, cultural rights, all of them together. So I just want to underscore that feature of Commissioner Someo's inquiry. And one other feature, there are many, but one other feature that I set great store by is the very, very effective communication dimension of the inquiry. That is reaching out to, using social media constantly, using the news press, the written press, using TV, using radio, and so forth. So that comms element of the national inquiry is exceedingly important, it seems to me, as I watch my colleagues run their fantastic national inquiry. More briefly, I wondered if I could ask a question of Rosalie. Thank you for outlining your important work. I have one question. There are many, but I'm going to confine myself to one. So in your work, and when you are doing your many consultations that you referred to, is there, does the issue of white supremacy emerge? Is the issue of white supremacy explicit? Is it part of the agenda? Is it discussed? And I'm interested because this concept, it seems to me, its profile is being raised in various different jurisdictions. And I just wondered whether it was something that is explicitly discussed and addressed in the context of your work. Thank you very much, Rosalie. Thank you, Pip.
Thanks so much for the question, Paul. I'm sorry, I've just switched off my camera because I'm experiencing some internet issues. So just to hear more clearly and to hopefully be more audible. Yes, absolutely. The issue of white supremacy has emerged, especially in our consultations with community. And I think it is something that we will hear more about in the next phase of the framework development as we have more community consultations. As I mentioned earlier, we only, we had the privilege of having 10 community consultations in that early scoping phase. And I should say that that was also a consequence of our very limited resourcing for that first year of the framework development. We also were working with $200,000 but over the course of that time, including staff on the project as well. Sorry, Paul, go ahead.
I'm interested to know, if you care to share it, it's your call, whether or not there is resistance to the use of the concept of white supremacy. Is it regarded as very provocative? Does it engender a lot of controversy? Is there a resistance to it or not?
Yes, yes, there absolutely is. And, you know, we spoke to a number of different types of organizations as part of this project, and, you know, where people were coming from, they often found that confronting or divisive to discuss. And I don't know if you've seen the Commission's refresh of the Racism It Stops With Me campaign. So initially the campaign had a more of a focus on interpersonal racism, but this refresh, although we've retained the branding, our focus is much more on systemic racism. And we're hoping to I guess, invite reflection by white Australians on their privilege, but what we really are trying to reconceptualize as rights that they experience that other communities do not. To the same extent. And we are trying to introduce the concept of white supremacy, and there are some resources that the Commission provides on the Racism It Stops With Me website that talk about what white supremacy is, and try to kind of, I guess, break down the barriers that people might have to kind of coming to that concept, whether they're personal, you know, and taking that on at the individual level, and, you know, taking on as a kind of attack against themselves, rather than understanding the systematic nature, I suppose, of white supremacy and systemic racism. You know, in this report, we're really trying to ground the principles for the framework that we want to develop in First Nations sovereignty and truth-telling around Australia's violent colonial history and settler colonisation and the continued kind of harms that it experienced as a result of that. So, yeah, I guess we do, in that sense, we are talking about white supremacy already in this report, and we do see that it's really important for us to, and we heard from community members who are at the centre, and we want to be at the centre of our approach moving forward, that has to happen, and that without that happening, we can't have an anti-racism framework, especially in Australia's context.
Thank you very much, Rosalie. It's really helpful to hear those remarks, and good luck with your really important, valuable work. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for the question.
Yes, thanks, Rosalie, and thank you, Paul, too. And I think your point, Paul, about the holistic and integrated approach that you've highlighted is really important, particularly with national inquiries, and that interconnection between economic, social, cultural, political rights, really very important as well. So thank you for that. And I wonder if any other participants, and can I also include my colleagues from the APF Secretariat, if they also wish to raise any questions with our members, it's a great time to do so. Again, too, if any of the speakers wish to raise questions or make comments on their co-speakers' presentations, please do. Be very happy.
Yeah.
Yes, please, Karenina.
I was just wondering, and especially when I was listening to our colleague from India, in terms of the informal sector. So one of the things that I know is the work that we are doing, of course, doesn't touch the informal sector in terms of the inequities. And certainly what we know is some of our undocumented workers or those who are here illegally work in the informal sector. The construction sector in particular is one where we know, there are significant numbers of Pacific people there. We can't, I'm not sure how we can help them. So one of the things that we're asking for is pathways to residency and permanent residence for people who've been here. Some of them are grandparents, and parents, so they have been working and contributing to the profitability of businesses. But it's a problem. So we value their talent, their accumulated years of experience, but we can't protect them unless they have proper contracts and things like that. So unfortunately, exploitation is suffered by them. So the inquiry doesn't go into the informal sector, but we are aware that is a big gap and there's huge vulnerability there in terms of exploitation. So I'll be really interested in hearing perhaps from our other colleagues who presented in terms of any work that you're doing in employment, in terms of the rights of people in the informal sector. I'll just leave that question there because I don't know how to go about it. If somebody else does, I'd love to hear about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Karenina. I don't know, did the Indian Commission wish to make a comment on that, or the Australian Commission about the informal sector? Mr. Jain?
Yes, ma'am. So,
thank you.
If a query is, what is the National Human Rights Commission doing with respect to gender pay parity in the informal sector? So, like I said, we have a core group on women, and this core group comprises all the stakeholders, including representatives of the government, the civil society, academia, and human rights defenders. This core group meets periodically, and they bring in the wealth of experience that they have in advocacy and protection of human rights in the field. And they deliberate on different issues and on the consequences of different government policies and on the field situation, what is the extent and nature of gender pay parity or other kinds of disparities based on gender. And based on that, the Commission formulates its recommendations. So after COVID, for instance, we submitted 19 advisories to the government on different issues, including, for instance, women, migrant workers. In a lot of these, women also came in, like in migrant workers, also women figured. In addition, we sponsor research on different subjects, including disparate gender discrimination. That is one of them. So these are different ways in which we handle these subjects.
Thanks, Mr. Jain. Commissioner Sumio, it's Rosalie from the Australian Human Rights Commission. I just really wanted to comment that as part of the very initial consultations that we did, especially speaking with community, but also community representative organisations, we did hear about this in particular in relation to international students and their experiences, particularly since the pandemic. Although I don't really have any answers to your question as to how we address it as yet, it is something that's definitely it's been raised as a priority concern and something that we do hope to continue work around moving forward with this project. Yes.
Thank you all. And I think too in Australia, the government's currently talking about, we have many staff shortages here in the country, and there's a lot of discussion with Pacific Island states about coming to Australia and working, and I think that's going to be a really interesting, could even be a cross connection between even the work of the New Zealand Commission and the Australian Commission, but there will be perhaps a really important area for the Commission to consider, how that pathway to Australia and into normally informal sectors, fruit picking, all that kind of work, is monitored into the future. So really interesting question. Thank you. And I have my colleague, Phil Wardle. He is the Legal and Policy Manager at the APF Secretariat, and he would like to ask a question. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, thanks, Pip. And it's a follow-up question for Dr. Karenina from the New Zealand Commission. And Karenina, look, I should say it's really been fantastic to follow the progress of this inquiry. I remember your visit to Sydney and hearing about your plans would have been before the pandemic, I think. And
yes.
So, look, it's been such a wonderful initiative to follow and to see some of the findings you've uncovered so far. I guess one of the things, and I know the detail of the recommendations are yet to be released, but in terms of your engagement with business and organisations, were there any kind of good practices or positive practical mechanisms that you uncovered during the inquiry that organisations had set up maybe on their own initiative without that policy framework that I know you'll be advocating for? That you identified as some good practices in terms of strengthening or reducing the pay gap, the Pacific pay gap? It'd be great to hear. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, it's a really good question, Philip. And thank you for remembering our conversation when it was all a dream when we first met, and now it's happening. In our conversation, there was a general recognition that there was inequity, and that we had to do something about it because it was accepted that we have this thing called the gender pay gap. So if we can recognize that, then there's no reason why we wouldn't recognize that there's an ethnic pay gap, because we know racism exists. Unfortunately, none of them, or maybe one of them, had actually recorded the ethnicity of their workforces. So unless you record that data, you don't really know for sure where you're starting from. So that was one of the, I suppose, the big finding is that, businesses believed that they were paying fairly, that they were acting in good faith, but they couldn't prove it to themselves that was the case. And so that's one of the key recommendations, and start with the data. I mean, that was the main reason why we were able to progress with the gender pay gap, is that we started collecting the data. So we say start with that first, and then there's this question of trust. Those who have asked for data don't always get the response back from their staff. And so what my advice is that we'll try to understand why it is that people are not giving you that data. Is it because of past experience? Because certainly when it comes to the people of our lands, our Tangata Whenua and Pacific people, we will tell you where we come from and everything. We don't have an issue with it. So if people aren't telling you that, there's a problem. So it's about workplace culture and feeling safe and that sort of thing. So we're talking with businesses about how to navigate those spaces. Certainly in terms of, our public service has got now a national program to close ethnic and gender pay gaps. And that's great in terms of role modeling what can happen. So they've developed a tool in terms of how do you measure ethnicity, because, a lot of us have multiple ethnicities, eh? So there's a tool that's being developed. I've said to the private sector, take it. We've spent public money developing the tool. Use that. Don't spend any more money. Use that. So then we can compare apples with apples, as opposed to everybody developing their own tool. So the public service has been a great leader in this space. They're now requiring core public services to report ethnicity data, and also to see a program in terms of how they're closing the inequities. So that's, so New Zealand, in terms of the public service, they're making great strides. We're now wanting the public service to try and influence what we call crown entities, which is the next layer, including a public, including the Human Rights Commission, to also adopt those tools and adopt the reporting so that we can all move forward together. But in the private sector, we're a long way away. We have a group, there's a campaign called Mind the Gap that's going on in the private sector, led by really influential, great women here in New Zealand from the corporate world. And they've developed a framework to help businesses record their ethnicity data as well as gender data. So that's there. So there is movement happening, but to be honest, I can't say hand on heart that there's one that's sort of at the level where we can say, they're doing okay. Everyone's making an attempt. And what I always say is, even if the initial picture is terrible, it's okay. Just make a start. And then, then we can go from there. So that's the latest. So I don't know if there's a company in Australia that's measuring ethnicity data. Because, you're well ahead of us in terms of pay transparency. I'll be really interested if there is. Or even in India, if there's someone else is measuring ethnicity data anywhere, I'll be really interested.
Thanks, Karenina. Look, fantastic experience to learn from. And I think the data, emphasis on data and how important that is really, really great insight. Thanks very much.
Oh, good.
I just thought I'd jump in and respond to Commissioner Sumio's question there. I guess we're not really in a strong position to report on ethnicity data in workplaces as well. And that is this issue about the lack of data collection is also a key finding that's come out of our initial process as well. And we've had really similar issues expressed to us that you outlined, Commissioner, around, it's quite tied to the cultural safety issue, people not feeling that they can disclose their ethnicity within the workplace. But also we've heard a lot, and this is tied to a broader issue around collection of data on cultural diversity in Australia, even thinking about the census, that it's not inclusive at all, and it's not a self-determined way of identifying culture or racial background. And so that's something that, we've heard that the government is going to be working towards or initiating a consultation process around that, which we support. And but in terms of specifically in relation to workplaces and specific sectors, it's very patchy. There are some movements similarly here as well, like with, in particular sectors. In the arts sector, there's a strong movement towards data collection. There are a few projects that are doing some work to try and, for example, across the screen, to collect data on ethnicity across screen. And in the arts more broadly, there are a few. So the Everyone project is one. And then there are smaller advocacy organisations who engage with businesses and the creative sector to audit themselves and kind of, develop programs to improve their cultural racial diversity. So, but I think we have a very similar sort of situation here as well.
Thanks, Rosalie, and thanks, Phil, as well for the question. Colleagues, we have had questions from the Human Rights Commissions of Myanmar and the Philippines and New Zealand too. And I know we have representatives from a number of our other members, including Thailand and Korea, Timor-Leste and Bahrain. And I'm wondering if anyone and other institutions as well would like to pick up on any of the questions or points, especially around data collection, which I think is especially important in our work. If anyone would like to make any final questions to our speakers, any comments, please let me know. Otherwise, we will wrap up the session. Okay, yes, Korea, Yuntek, hello, welcome.
Hello. If I introduce briefly the situation in South Korea with regard to gender pay gap, I led a report released recently from a Business Research Institute. According to the survey results, the gender pay gap stands at 31% between male and female workers. And the main reasons are mostly the discontinuation of female workers' professional career paths owing to childbirth, child rearing, and also breastfeeding. So it is quite noticeable that from the last 3 decades, since the collection of the data, Korea has steadily improved in gender pay gap. But since the outbreak of pandemic and lockdown, mostly the burden of a caregiver in family go to women's burden. So more and more female workers participate in labor market, but mostly female workers go on maternity leave. So that's why one of the reasons that the pay gender gap is stuck in the 30% disparity. So I wonder, among the APF member institutions, is there any policy or practice to address in the desirable role of our commission? Thank you.
Thank you, Yuntak. It's a really interesting, it's a very large gap, pay gap, isn't it? 31% between men and women. And again, it's interesting how you note the impact of COVID, and other speakers have as well, including Karenina, you know, and others, that the impact that COVID has had, particularly on women and vulnerable groups, making them more vulnerable in this period, including in relation to pay equity. I wonder if anyone would like to respond to that. Some commissions may undertake surveys in relation to the gender gap or ethnicity gap in pay. And some countries have other agencies that do that. May not be the National Human Rights Institution, but there may be other agencies that undertake that kind of analysis. I don't know if that is the case in Korea, Yuntak, but I'll open up the floor. Would anyone like to respond to that?
I just wonder perhaps if I could just respond briefly to Yuntak. Your pay gap, it's actually not that far off from the Pacific pay gap. So our gender pay gap in New Zealand for the general population is about 9%, but the pay gap for Pacific women is around 27%. So we're not that far off from you. And for Pacific men, between Pacific men and European men is around 25%. That's how huge the gap is here in New Zealand, which is why we're doing this inquiry. And that's on average, on the average hourly rate. So whether you're working part-time or full-time, that's the average hourly rate comparison. But so, you know, so one of the reasons we hear is, well, maybe because women do, of course, tend to be the ones who go and you know, look after the children or look after an elderly parent or someone else. But that only explains a little bit of it. And then people say, well, maybe it's because of qualifications that that we get in this big gap. Well, that only explains a little bit of it. What we're finding, and this is the research that's come out, and when it comes to Pacific women, you know, over 60% of the gap is unexplained. So it can't be explained by education or the child rearing and childbirth. And so that's why we did the inquiry. And the interesting thing about the education factor, when we looked at our data, our Asian population actually have a higher rate of holding degrees and postgraduate degrees than our European brothers and sisters. But the pay isn't following the education for our Asian brothers and sisters. So there's definitely a problem that we need to identify in terms of the pay gap. If only we knew the answers, then we'd have the solutions, but we only know bits of it at the moment. But just to say that that where you are is where New Zealand is if we're looking from the perspective of Pacific peoples. Yeah. But all the best to you, Yontek.
Yeah. Thanks, Karenina. I will just quickly add that in Australia, there is a workplace gender equity agency, and it's recently, or in February this year, it published that the gender pay gap, full-time gender pay gap, is at 13.8%. It goes into quite a bit of detail across the country and also across the gaps in various industries. I'd be very happy to forward that on to you, Yuntak, and others if interested. And it does provide some analysis as to the factors that have created that pay gap, including, as you've mentioned, women's disproportionate share of unpaid caring and domestic work, and women's greater time out of the workforce impacting career progression and opportunities. So that's just a few that it's mentioned there, and I'd be happy to forward that on to you. Dear participants, we are getting towards the end of our time together, so that any last opportunity to make a comment, please do. Otherwise, we will conclude the dialogue for today. I don't see any hands raised at this point. I'd like to basically thank you all for attending. I want to also acknowledge my co-workers at the APF Secretariat. I see that I have Twee Doan-Smith. Twee, I don't know whether you want to say hello to people here too, or Phil, again, just to show your face as part of the APF team. We are all working remotely these days at the APF Secretariat, so we come to you from our homes. And there's Twee. Thanks, Twee, and thanks, Phil. And we have other co-workers who aren't with us today. Participants, members, thank you again for your time. I'd like to just quickly hand over to the New Zealand Human Rights Commission, who have been a terrific partner to suggest this really critically important item for us to discuss today. Just to make some final comments, and then I'll make some final comments, and then we will conclude. So please, Karenina, I give the floor to you.
So just want to say thank you very much, Pip and our APF Secretariat team, for bringing us together. Employment provides so much, a sense of purpose, a life of dignity. It's so important for NHRIs to play a key role in advancing rights of all of our peoples in this space. So it's been really valuable for us to share our experience and to learn from you. I'm just thinking in terms of our colleague from India, you talked about several pieces of legislation where you've legislated for equal pay in there. And also you talked about the struggles that you're facing in terms of making that a reality for the women in India. I thank you for sharing that and sharing your struggle and your humility in that. Similarly, we have laws here in New Zealand, and yet it's still not a reality for so many women, but also so many people of color and our new migrants. So thank you for sharing that story. Thank you to Australia for sharing about the work that you're doing with your Indigenous peoples, your Indigenous communities, the cultural safety. We're really interested in seeing what that looks like, because I'd imagine with the diversity amongst your Indigenous peoples, there is no one model. as we think about our Indigenous peoples here too, and the different iwis and their different approaches, and we're always reminded they are not homogenous either. And it's really important that we listen to the different iwi or tribes here. So thank you very much for that. It's been an absolute pleasure for us to share our learnings and our journey so far in this space. And I wish you well and safety, and hopefully we'll meet each other again someday, face to face. So whaftai lava, yeah, manuia.
Many thanks, Karenina. We also very much hope to meet you all face to face as well. I don't have much to add, but I do certainly want to congratulate all of you for participating today and for your time, Karenina, Rosalie and Rajiv as well. It really is appreciated. And the APF team really do love seeing you. We do miss the connection in person. So we really hope these dialogues in some way fill the gap in that connection. It certainly is not the preference, but it's the next best thing, and why we've introduced this series. But it's also such an important motivation and reminder about the powers of a national human rights institution and their role, and what they can do. And for me as well, it's also about how they work with stakeholders and allies in conducting of their work, because none of us work in a vacuum. So that's always really important to remember and to consider. And we just want to thank you all for participating. I think this may be the last dialogue for this year. There are other programs that we're running, of course, during the year with my colleagues. But my understanding is that this will be the last one for the year, but we will be looking forward to bringing the dialogue back to you next year, even in a virtual form, because I still think it does have value in that way. So from all of us at the APF Secretariat, thank you. We wish you well, and we look forward to seeing you again at some point. Thank you.